started the recording. Everything seems to be okay. So when you're ready, take it away.
3, 2, 1. Hey there, welcome to the Canadian Philosophy Show. My name is Hale, and I'm here today with Mike. Today we're going to be talking about a wide and difficult, but very, I think, pertinent topic for our society today, and that's how do we ascribe and understand responsibility in terms of our current climate crisis. And I want to start off our discussion by reading out a short piece from called "World Scientists' Warning of the Climate Emergency." It's from 2019, and it was it's basically a call to action by over 11,258 scientists from 153 countries, and they just have this to say. They say, scientists have a moral obligation to clearly warn humanity of any catastrophic threat and to tell it like it is. On the basis of this obligation and the geographical indicators presented below, we declare, with more than 11,000 scientist signatories from around the world, clearly and unequivocally, the planet Earth is facing a climate emergency. So with that being said, how do we transition from recognizing that emergency to recognizing what we do about it? And with what we do about it, how do we understand, in a sense, who is responsible for doing what? Do we talk to individuals, or do we talk more about organizations, or even in a broader sense, do we talk about nations and states and their responsibility and their liability in understanding how we confront the current climate crisis? With that said, Mikey, do you have anything else that you'd like to open with?
Well, I think we're presupposing that there is a such thing as moral obligation, and that's actually been a topic of our previous two of our previous shows. I mean, I just want to include people or acknowledge people who don't believe we have moral obligation or who believe that it's very relative. So, I think for the purposes of our discussion, we're going to have to assume. We're going to have to stipulate that there is a such thing as moral responsibility, because otherwise people are just living for themselves, and it doesn't matter what you argue, right? If I can hoard more for myself during my lifetime, then who cares about the effect on the Earth, or who cares about future generations? So I propose that we stipulate that we're going to try and rise above that and assume that we may have moral obligations, or we do have moral obligations which transcend our own immediate perceived personal interests.
Totally, and I think there's more to be said there. And also, I mean, I agree. I think we should probably start with saying that we're not going to slip into kind of ethical egoism, although that's a discussion for a different time. But there's different, when we talk about responsibility and how we ascribe responsibility, there's different ways in which, and perhaps sometimes maybe the term moral is a little loaded. But I know that a lot of people think about it in terms of moral responsibility, but some people think about it in a wider sense, where it's consequence responsibility, not so much the moral obligation or the intentionality involved in the personhood, but more in the emphasis of who is responsible for what kind of causation and how and why, and to what degree does liability come into that equation, depending on the context, essentially.
Yeah, and you brought up a good point, and actually some of the theorists over the last couple decades have addressed this, which is there individual responsibility, or is it merely a responsibility of states? So do I, as a Canadian, do I have a personal responsibility to be aware of and be accountable for the consequences of my personal lifestyle, for my ecological footprint, for the waste products that are generated by my consumption, or can I just pass the buck to the country and say, well, Canada negotiates with other countries and enters into treaties on my behalf, and so I don't have to worry about it.
Yeah, and I think we can start to think about that, like dividing it. We can sort of look at different moral entities, and we can sort of think about, there's individuals, there's organizations, there's states, and then there's also, as some people will argue, especially within the context of climate change, there's also nations, which are different from states, and we can get into what that kind of looks like. You're absolutely right, because I think especially on the context of climate change, and like full disclosure, I'm not a climate scientist. I don't even think that's the right terminology. But the truth is, when we look at this great existential threat, the reality is me going out and driving my car, or better yet, saying me no longer driving and me reducing my own personal ecological footprint. What someone can ask, what real consequence is that going to have on the overarching issue? In what way am I responsible when my own personal, we can say very personal, private, limited actions have such a negligible effect on the whole, on the whole situation, all things being equal? Mm-hmm. And that's certainly an argument that people make.
Mm-hmm. Well, I have two arguments why individuals are personally responsible, and I'll make them brief. One is that is the whole principle of personal responsibility, which is promoted by by libertarians in the United States and in Canada. The idea that the government can't control all of our actions, and we have a certain amount of personal freedom to make our own decisions. In fact, that principle is being asserted right now in this debate over lockdowns and so on regarding the COVID-19 pandemic, and governments, provincial governments, federal governments, state governments are trying to find their way in this gray area of how much do we dictate by law and regulation versus how much do we allow people to make their own decisions. And there is definitely a principle in operation. It's in tension, right? TENSION, with the idea of government control, but the idea of personal freedom. So, for example, right now you can, depending on which jurisdiction you're in, you may be able to go to a restaurant, you may be able to go to a bar, you may be able to have public gatherings. The governments in various jurisdictions are regulating that to some extent, but a lot of that is your own personal decision. What risk are you willing to take? And many governments have been reluctant, especially the more conservative governments in state governments in the United States have been very reluctant to regulate people's behavior, and they leave it up to people whether they want to go to the beach and go to a party or go to spring break or whatever, and risk spreading COVID. So that's the idea of personal freedom, and so with personal freedom comes personal responsibility. So if you can't have it both ways. I mean, if I have personal freedom to make my own decisions and the government isn't going to legislate or control everything I do, then that does make me responsible for my decisions, including excessive consumption, which causes pollution and excessive strain on the resources of the earth, and excessive ecological footprint. So that's one of my arguments. And my second argument is based on the theory of John Searle, philosopher from UC Berkeley, which is that countries, nations, governments are examples of what he calls institutional reality. They don't exist in the objective world. These are creations of human beings. And so if I am living a lifestyle which where I consume and then release waste into the atmosphere or the oceans, that's objectively the case. That's a physical, objective fact. And so it's conflating institutional reality with objective reality. If we talk about, well, my objective behavior is irrelevant, but what's relevant is the subjective behavior, the institutional behavior. So if you know what I'm saying, it's like my objective behavior is what's actually affecting the earth. I shouldn't be able to appeal to to the institutional reality created by political entities to absolve myself of the responsibility for my own objective behavior.
Yeah, and that's a really interesting point, and I think this also brings up. So I think I kind of want to, as you say that, Mike, I'm thinking a couple of things. When I'm thinking actually about more of that article that I opened with for folks listening, the World Scientists Warning of Climate Emergency. And in that document, they talk about what's the real most significant cause of climate change. It's not necessarily, or the climate industry so generally, and what it is on a very simplified scale is not any individual institution or any individual business. It's particularly the advancement generally of Western living standards. Right? So generally speaking, Western people who consume have a much larger ecological footprint than many other parts of the world, being able to, every single one of us, by and large, live in our own place with that's quite large, and all the things that involve going to build that, all the the energy that we take up, vehicles, etc., all the stuff that we own and buy and consume, that whole process, that whole kind of way of living and culture is the main, in the arguments from these scientists at least, is the main driver of the climate crisis. That then leads into the second part that you're kind of talking about, which is that what's pointing out there is the reference to individual responsibility. And when we talk about individual responsible writ large, we come to confront what we might call national responsibility. And national responsibility is different than state responsibility, because national responsibility represents, you might just call the community generally, whereas state responsibility represents institutions. Right, and so the thing about institutions is state institutions is in this case, like you're saying, it doesn't seem that the evidence doesn't seem to show that we can just pass the buck to the economics minister or the military or the Justice Department or whatever it might be, and say that's where the problem really lies. As you're saying, objectively speaking, the problem of climate change does not lie with these institutions; it lies with the people as a whole. So we can't just pass that off to the state.
Yeah, and furthermore, in a capitalist society where the market is in control, with the exception of some government regulation, the whole principle behind capitalism is that there will be reasonable controls, so you don't have unfettered capitalism. But at the same time, in large part, the economy is driven by by supply and demand, rather than by political agendas, or philosophical agendas. When you get into that, the latter, you're starting to talk about communist societies where theories of justice and so on, economic justice and justice for workers, started to drive the policy. But in capitalist societies, it's argued that the market forces should be what drives policy, with some amount of control. But so therefore, if that's the case, then individuals do have a responsibility for their actions, because their actions drive the economy. So if there's a market for gas guzzling automobiles, then according to capitalist principles, they'll be profitable to manufacture and to sell. And if the market goes away, if people don't demand them anymore, there's less demand for them, there'll be less of them manufactured. So therefore, individuals do have a responsibility because they create the market.
Let me ask you this: in terms of the market nation state market-driven nation state that we live in, particularly the United States, or many of these places which are the biggest drivers of the current climate crisis, do you think that we can pin or ascribe responsibility to said nation, Or do you think that that responsibility is entirely and completely dispersed among the individuals? Do you think it makes sense to talk of a nation being responsible for climate change? Like, if I say to you, the United States is the prime driver of climate change, do you think that that proposition makes sense?
It does, so long as we understand that the United States is the sum total of the people that live in the United States. And so the United States isn't actually, as I said before, according to, the theory of institutional reality, the United States is an imaginary entity. What's objectively true are the actions of people that live in the United States and in other countries. So, when you talk about the responsibility of the United States, we're really talking about the people that live there. Not that everybody is equally responsible. I mean, certainly there's a dynamic of large corporations driving much of the, creating their own market and being profit driven. So of course there's all the dynamics that happen within a country. But if there were no people, there would be no country.
And I see, and when I think about it, I think when we start talking, and I bring that up because a lot of the discussion is about asking about, in what sense are nations as a whole responsible? Like, and this is, we hear this talk actually come up explicitly in questions like with the recent Trump administration and the Paris Accord, climate change accord, and all that kind of stuff, where they talked about the United States doesn't need to be involved in this. The United States is not responsible. The United States can figure out its own. And I think that when we think about a nation, we think about a group of people with a shared identity and public culture. And shared values and ways of associating with one another that have specific styles and intricacies. And in this case, for much of the world, those specific ways of, as the better way of saying is being the way that they are, has led to this, existential climate crisis. And so then we're able to ask questions about in what way does the general whole of the way that, let's say the United States or Canada is, in what way does that style of being of a nation need to rectify itself? In what way is it responsible? In what way does it need to change or is liable? Right? Because it's liable.
Well, if nothing else, at least in countries where the vote matters, one has a responsibility to vote for politicians and for governments which will be more responsible vis-a-vis climate justice, ecological justice, and so on, at the very least. So I don't think one can just absolve him or herself of individual responsibility, but at the same time we need to recognize that the corporations that are very powerful, that governments are very powerful, and so it's a complex situation.
Yeah, and I think you've talked about like the objective situation. I forget the exact language that you used with Cyril, but like the fact of the matter, and the fact of the matter is, especially when we think about outcome responsibility, where we attribute consequences to an actor, like where anything else being equal, the resulting benefits or burdens or liabilities should fall to them, right? So if basically if I cause something, all other things being equal, so essentially barring any explicitly odd circumstances, I'm in some sense responsible, and to what degree that's determined in each kind of case. But I think you're absolutely right. Where look, the entity of, let's call BP or Walmart or some very, very large corporation, certainly has, just literally by virtue of what it is, has a much larger footprint, impact, and also has a much larger capacity for response than, say, you or I. But on the flip side of that, at the beginning I opened up and said, my part is my responsibility. Like if I'm called to be responsible, like what I actually can do is extremely negligible. Well, um, thinking kind of about some universalizable or normative principles here. Like if that's the stance that everybody takes, which for a long time in many ways it has been, we run into a lot of issues because, well, like literally just me. The impact that I can have is minute, tiny. But the fact of the matter is I am part of a nation or a community that, as a whole, made up of many versions of myself, many citizens. That's where the impact comes in, right? And so the call is not literally just to me. The call is to all of us.
Right. So maybe we can go back again to our original discussion where we talked about morality. I brought up the idea of morality, like why does it matter? So when philosophers talk about climate change, they often talk about climate change from an ethical perspective. In other words, what's the justification or what's the imperative? What's the rationale for protecting the earth and for protecting future generations from our actions? So why does it matter from an ethical point of view? So it's really an ethicist's issue to a great degree in philosophy. Scientists talk about the scientific ramifications and justifications and models and so on, and which are actually in dispute by some people, but we're not going to get into that right now. But philosophers generally talk about the ethical ramifications, like why, from a philosophical point of view, from an ethical point of view, does it matter what happens to the earth or what happens to future generations? So maybe we can work in John Rawls here, and then a couple more recent or later theorists, because we can follow this train, this thread from Rawls into some subsequent theorists about what the justification is for from a justice point of view, from an ethical point of view, the justification for intergenerational justice, which is what we're talking about when we're talking about climate change. So maybe we can start with Rawls' domestic view of justice, and then expand into international, and then intergenerational.
Mm-hmm. So we can think about actually, just for our listeners, we have a short little piece by Rawls here where we can talk about, and Rawls talks about justice as what he calls fairness. And he says, justice is fairness recasts the doctrine of the social contract. The fair terms of social cooperation are conceived of as agreed to by those engaged in it, by free and equal citizens who are born into the society in which they lead their lives.
Right.
Their agreement.
Yeah.
No, go. I was just going to say, but their agreement, like any other valid agreement, must be entered into under the appropriate conditions. In particular, these conditions must be situated free and equal persons, fair, and must not allow some persons greater bargaining advantages than others.
Yes, and the thought experiment that he suggests, that he puts forth to demonstrate how that might happen in theory, would be what's known as the veil of ignorance.
Yeah.
And I'm going to read right from my own words from my midterm exam in one of the classes I took, which I think you've probably taken the same class. Public reason, this is what Rawls calls this process. Public reason emerges from agreements people make from behind the imaginary veil of ignorance. Right? So before they're born in this thought experiment, they all get together and negotiate what the rules will be. Such agreements reflect the needs for equality, justice, equal opportunity, equal access to governmental positions, and freedom of expression.
Yeah. So it's, if we want to create a society where that that experiences justice as fairness, if that's the way things are, well, we got to ask ourselves, how do we first understand what that fairness would be like? And what Rawls is asking us to do is, as like you mentioned, before people are in a way born, is go to what he calls the original position, which is behind what he calls the veil of ignorance. And basically, the point of that is we're stripping ourselves of any of the personalizing factors of who we are. So basically, you and I, Makey, we're behind the veil of ignorance for everyone else. We're just citizens of X nation. Right? That's all we know. And as we then ask ourselves as a community, considering that we know that we're just going to be citizens of X nation, and particularly for when we'll get into this maybe a little bit more, but citizens of X nation at X time, or X generation, what would we all agree upon, knowing that before we re-enter into the world with all our individual personalizing factors? What do we think would make the most sense, that would be the most fair, before everybody knows where they actually land in society?
Right, and it's precisely because people don't know where they're going to land, like whether they're handicapped or not, what race they are, what class they're born into. Because they don't know that, they wouldn't want to take the risk of showing up in a downtrodden, deprived class. So there's more equality, so everybody will be happy with, at least somewhat satisfied with the way they do wind up being born. That's the theory behind it. But as you said, this is a domestic theory. And so Rawls does go on to address international relations. And his theory of international relations is called the law of peoples. And there's actually a second trip to the behind the veil of ignorance. But what's notable, and this is what is in dispute more recently, is that Rawls' idea of the second experiment, the second trip to the behind the veil of ignorance, is that it's nations negotiating with other nations. It's not individuals within those nations. So, and not only that, but Rawls is very concerned, in order to be successful in creating this society of peoples, you need to be inclusive of maybe not all, but of most nations. So you may have to lower the standards, because you can't expect every nation to be a democratic nation, a liberal democracy. So he lowers the standards. He does still have some standards, but he wants to be inclusive. So I wrote here, in addressing international relations, Rawls seemed concerned with inclusiveness, i.e. allowing as many nations as possible to join the Society of Peoples, the community of well-ordered states. He does this by lowering the standards vis-a-vis treatment of its own people to which a foreign state must adhere, relative to Rawls' domestic standard of public reason. So, for example, although both public reason and Rawls' international standard requires basic liberties such as equality before the law, freedom from slavery, and freedom of religion, decent hierarchical peoples requires neither freedom of expression nor equal access to holding official government positions. So in other words, when it comes to international relations, Rawls is forgiving, or still would include countries which does not allow freedom of expression and doesn't allow equal access to holding government positions. In other words, like a dictatorship. He would still include those behind the second veil of ignorance in nations that can negotiate with each other as to what the world order should be. But the important point here is that is that in Rawls' vision, and this comes back to what we're talking about individual versus national responsibility, in the arena of global affairs, the law of peoples applies to entities of countries in negotiation with each other, and Rawls comes under great criticism for including countries which are not democratic and would not measure up to his standard, which he lays out for domestic justice.
Yeah, and I think this is really important and particularly talking about, the realities of thinking about how individual nations are responsible in terms of what they should do with, dealing with the climate crisis. The reason being is that, we can call the climate crisis not just an existential issue, but like a world existential issue, in that it affects everybody everywhere. And so, what you're talking about, Mikey, is hinting at how Rawls, especially in the Law of Peoples, talks about, both ideal and non-ideal theories. In the ideal Law of Peoples, we would have, a body of nations coming together, which are all under the guise of justice as fairness, all fairly and properly constructed. But he notes that while that's a good way to make a theory, that's not very accurate in terms of how, even if we have one ideal nation, which is questionable, like to begin with, but let's say that we do. The reality is that the nation of justice as fairness still is going to have to deal with nations that don't fall under that category. And this becomes particularly true in terms of things like climate change, where all of our involvements and efforts are needed, and we can't just really. It's not really reasonable to say that we should cut each other off, because it might be the fact that Canada decides to take serious steps to avoid climate change, but if our neighbors to the south do nothing or actively work in the opposite direction, and the existential issue that's threatening both of us is really not getting anywhere. How then essentially Rawls wants to ask us, in that non-ideal position, how do we make a Law of Peoples where we can deal with states and nations that may not be who we would ideally want to be dealing with?
Right. So we can see where Rawls, seeing international relations as being negotiations between countries and de-emphasizing individuals, lays this groundwork for the problem that we have of how can individuals be accountable for the consequences of their actions. If Rawls' theory is correct that it's just nations negotiating with each other, how do we bring individuals and individual responsibility into the world picture? And then the second problem is, then how do we jump from intragenerational justice to intergenerational justice? And so then we have other theorists like Mullendorf, for example, who tries to make this bridge between Rawls' original position, veil of ignorance, thought experiment, to international and then intergenerational justice. So the first step is to critique or criticize Rawls' conception of the Law of Peoples, of international justice, as being simply negotiations between countries, but rather to revise that to have the individuals in the countries stand out more and become what matter. And so it does matter whether the country that a person lives in is democratic, and whether they have the same rights as they would have in a liberal democracy. That does matter. People do matter. Individuals emerge out of the the swamp and matter more in these revisions to Rawls' theories.
Yeah. Absolutely, and as you mentioned, particularly within the context of climate change, we then start to ask questions about, is what is most pertinent international issues, how nations, if we can so conceive them, are affecting one another, or in the present, or are we asking more questions about what the effects, and this is really what climate change is, the scare is all about, is it's never, I'm not worried about, my weekend being ruined by the sea level rising so much that my house gets wiped out, right? That's not really an actual concern for me here and now, but it seems reasonable enough that it might be in some way or another. a reasonable concern for another generation. So then, when we're trying to think of think of the ideal society as much as we can, in what sense are modern individuals and modern nations, and to a larger extent, the modern conglomeration nations with a lot of peoples, responsible for the future, and how do we determine that?
Right. So if we've now modified Rawls' veil of ignorance thought experiment to include all people of all generations, and we've also said that it's not simply countries negotiating with each other, but now people are responsible, then that means if behind this veil of ignorance we have people from all generations, and none of them know not only which social class, which race, which level of physical ability, but also which generation they're going to be born into, then it seems that they would have to negotiate with each other as individuals. They would have to negotiate the rules of the road, which protected all of them, no matter which generation.
Mm-hmm.
So that's the linkage here. So if we can imagine a revised veil of ignorance, where you didn't know which generation, nor which country, nor which segment of society you would be born into, then suddenly there is a responsibility, because you need to protect yourself in case you're born into a generation 200 years from now. You don't want to be born into a world that's destroyed by global warming. So yeah.
I was going to say, I just think I think our listeners can relate to this when we think about our own personal situations, and the fact that we do in our own, both I think personal lives and public lives, get frustrated with people by decisions from the past. We encounter things, whether or not they be like I said, in our own private worlds, or whether or not they be out in public. It might be the fact that 50 years ago, the roads around your house were built to a very shoddy, lazy standard. And now every day that you go out to, drive to work, you drive over many potholes and you ruin your car. And we experience a real frustration with people in the past. That we start asking questions like, could things have been done better? And we deal with those consequences when they're not. But yet, at the same time, we often have a tendency to brush off our decision making when it comes to people in the distant future for ourselves. Right? It's very easy. It's one thing to think about, the effects of our actions on those in our immediate generation. It's another thing, perhaps because it seems more remote, and a lot of people talk about that kind of stuff in terms of ethics, so the nearness or farness of the effects, but that they seem easier to work around or rationalize when the negative consequences of our actions might be 50 or 100 years from now.
Right. So I'm going to read again from Mullendorf here.
Mm-hmm.
He says, he puts it very well here, the point that I was making before. He says, given the scope of climate change, the global scope of climate change, an appropriate original position employed to justify duties of justice with respect to the costs of carbon dioxide emissions necessarily would be cosmopolitan in seeking to prevent parties from bargaining on the basis of their citizenship status. Moreover, due to the intergenerational nature of the problem of climate change, the original position would also have to prevent strategic bargaining on behalf of one's own generation. So, Mullendorf here is trying to transcend citizenship status and generational status precisely because the costs and the consequences of greenhouse gas emissions are not restricted to those things. See, that this is the crux of it here, Hale.
Mm.
The problem has to, the solution has to match the problem. The problem is intergenerational. The problem is global. And therefore, the solution needs to be global and intergenerational. And by global, I mean it's not restricted to the country boundaries. So it's illogical to say that greenhouse gas emissions, which float up into the atmosphere, it's illogical to say that somehow those are restricted to a particular country. Maybe they're produced in certain countries, but the effects are borne by all countries. And in fact, it's even more complicated because, in fact, it's some of the poorest countries and the most disadvantaged people that have the greatest effects. But let's just say right now that the effects of carbon dioxide emissions know no international boundaries, and they also know no generational boundaries, and therefore people like Moellendorf and others have revised Rawls' conception of justice to be more individual and more global and intergenerational. So we can imagine going back to that thought experiment, behind the veil of ignorance. If you knew not which country you would be born into, nor which generation, those things would be irrelevant. You would simply have to negotiate for, or plan for, or lay down the rules such that everybody would be protected, and that would be not dependent on your country or generation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think you brought up a lot of really good stuff and really hit the crux of the problem. And I really like the word scope with moral issues, right? That we think about this all the time, but we take more seriously when dealing with moral issues and causes, and who's responsible. We take more seriously depending on who and how many are affected and in what way, right? And as you just so stated, climate change is a massively existential issue for everyone and requires, as said, a not just it requires responsibility to be found both in the international realm, the national, and the personal individual realm, and all of those are obviously interrelated and in some sense reflective of one another. And so yeah, it's a hard pill to swallow, and one thing that comes up when we talk like this, though, is the fact that we're very, very good at talking about what we might call small moral propositions or close moral propositions, and that I'm responsible for hitting Larry, and Larry got hurt. And we can look at the actors, we can look at the small scene in a sense, and very clearly articulate what's going on. As people and as communities, we seem to have a much harder way of wrestling with our moral responsibility and moral culpability on larger issues, and especially when the responsibility is diffused among among the wider population. It makes me think an example for listeners would be actually, in some sense, Nazi Germany and the Holocaust, in the sense of post-war people trying to reconcile their own responsibility within the context of that event, had a very, very hard time fitting themselves, understanding on a personal level where they fit in on a national or institutional level in such a wide crime. For some people, it was very obvious, and this is regardless of how people rationalized it or decide, what they'd said or didn't say. But for many people who operated in this sort of banal background, they had a very, very hard time coming to grips with understanding how they fit in that mechanism and how that translated to their own personal responsibility, their own liability. We all know the classic, like, I only signed paperwork, I only pushed numbers around on a chart, or whatever it might be, right? in some sense, although certainly the situation is different, and I'm not making comparisons between really between the two events, but in terms of thinking about the diffusion of moral responsibility, we can see how people today, with our own issues of climate change, have a hard time, and even listeners, even I think you're. I'll admit as like that I do too. You know, I don't walk out of my car, walk out of my house and look at my van every day and think this is a major way that I'm contributing to a serious existential issue. It's hard to make that leap. And so then the question becomes, in what way do we translate that responsibility? How do we actually, well, in what way do we translate that responsibility into a response?
Yeah. I wanted to point out something else too, in relation to what you're saying and what we said earlier. I want to make sure that we're not conflating morality with justice, because they're different things. Now, one might argue that justice is a moral imperative, but they may overlap on a Venn diagram, but they're not synonymous. So, sometimes when we think of morality, people think of like, religious doctrine, and or obligations that are somehow given by God, or if you're not if you're not religious, that at least they're part of human nature, or there's a moral reality that is objective, that is greater than humans. But we don't need to appeal to morality to talk about our obligations to future generations. So I just want to make this point here. So you can reject objective morality, but still find that there's an imperative for intergenerational and the and ecological justice, and I'll tell you why that is. So the great social contract theorists of the last couple centuries, starting with Hobbes, and then on to Rousseau, and even Kant in some ways is considered a social contract theorist. But let's talk about Hobbes, and then Rousseau, and Rawls also. They talk about justice in the sense of a social contract, not a moral imperative. So, Hobbes talked about how people actually live in a state of nature, or in a hypothetical state of nature, would have no morality. So Hobbes actually denied the existence of objective morality, and said that people will in a hypothetical state of nature, with no social contract, with no laws, with no police force, would fight each other to the death, because they'll all be out for their own personal gain. And so subsequently, the social contract theorists worked out ways of creating states with laws in order to keep people's personal interests in check, and enforce a system where people could live side by side without fear of constant war and death and so on, and a civil society. And so that's a social contract. It's not a moral contract. It's a social contract. And in fact, as I said, it's almost a denial of objective morality. Since there's no objective morality, we have no choice but to create a contract to save ourselves. So one can take that position. One can reject objective morality, or say that it's not relevant to this discussion, because we're trying to create a civil society. We're trying to create a society with justice, where people can live decent lives. Not because it's morally required to do so, but because it's rational to do so. Because why would we want to get behind the veil of ignorance and create a future society where half of us are going to be suffering, when I might be that person? So we create this social contract where everybody maybe not be equal, but at least has some some semblance or some minimal standard of living and protection. And so that's what we're talking about here. So we're talking about expanding that to peoples of all countries and people in future generations. because it's arbitrary to say, well, it only applies to our generation. In fact, a generation isn't even a well-defined thing. People are born every day. It's not like one generation ends and the next one begins. They're all, intertwined. Generation is a very loose term. It's a concept, but it's in reality there's constant. People are being born and people are dying, and it's a continuum. And so it's arbitrary to draw a line and say, well, on this side of is our generation, on the other side is the next generation, and the next generation doesn't matter because the next generation is now. Someone just got born, right?
And I think absolutely, and as you're saying that, we're talking, returning to the ideas of the contract and going behind that veil, and now we've expanded it out. We're talking about both the citizenry of today, and of tomorrow, and we're talking about the relationships internationally as well. And then we're thinking about that in the concept is particularly when we're making our contract to make our proper just society, right? And essentially we want the groundwork of that, or the main goal is we want the society to be able to exist. What I mean by that is it would seem insane to make allowances behind that veil that would arbitrarily overtly contradict what we're trying to do. So an argument can be made, and people have certainly made this argument, and in some sense this is what the scientists we brought up at the beginning were hinting at as well, and the fact that climate change is such an issue where if we don't articulate our just societies in a way to properly deal with it, there won't be the just societies that we're trying to articulate in the first place. Because it's a problem that at a point, and they actually talk about this, there will be a tipping point wherein there's essentially a point of no return. Well, things will get so bad that the preconditions that we're essentially working with are no longer there. And then we're sort of we're screwed, for lack of a better way of saying it, and we've allowed for such behavior that would destroy its own, in a sense destroy the actor. So it kind of when we take a step back, we can see how if we were behind the veil, we're talking about that, and someone put that out there as someone they want to fulfill, it obviously does not make sense.
Right. And I want to cite a contemporary theorist. Let's get the name here. Van der Heyden. So Van der Heyden says what I was saying before, which is that what's required when we talk about justice is international, interpersonal, and intertemporal. So we need to allocate resources with those scopes in mind: international, interpersonal, and intertemporal, because that's the way they're consumed. Individuals have ecological footprints. It's not just a country, the imaginary entity of a country that has an ecological footprint. Individuals, and it can be measured. And now, of course, it varies depending on the status in society and which country and the person's choices and that kind of thing. But the average North American, according to Van der Heyden, the average North American has an ecological footprint which is actually 4 to 5 times greater than the Earth's capabilities. In other words, it's not sustainable over time. But according to Van der Heyden, that's not just. It has nothing to do with morality. It's simply not. It's not rational. Because it's not sustainable, and people are born every day, and they're part of the next generation and the next generation, and we have an obligation to them. Why do we not have an obligation to someone who's 3 months old or 6 months old? At what age do we have an obligation to a person?
Yeah, and I think that's the key point. Like I was just saying, and you've obviously just brought up with Van der Heyden, that if we recognize that our scope is not just us, but is futural, is of the generations of tomorrow, that we have to, and which it would seem intuitively the case that it is. I mean, in a broad sense, our societies wouldn't, in terms of what we're doing and why we're doing it, what our societies operate, that we always operate with an eye to tomorrow, right? They would no longer really make sense if suddenly like we didn't account for the future. But currently, in many ways, we don't account for the future responsibly, right? And like Penrobin and others taking up, if the way in which we operate contradicts the very existence of the future that we have already defined as within our scope of how we need to operate in our current day, then that is not a legitimate way of operating. That's not a just way of continuing having continuity within the society.
Yeah, and now that I think about it, I've come to evolve, during this conversation for the last 55 minutes, away from a moral imperative simply to a practical, a pragmatic approach. If I, if I do something that's self-destructive, if I step off a cliff, and knowing that I'm, going to fall down to the bottom of the valley and die, I mean, that's just plain stupid. So that's a very clear example. So what if I went and stood on a cliff that I thought was going to erode, and maybe over the next few days I would fall off because it's the rocks are starting to crumble. Well, that's stupid too, but there's a delayed reaction. So combine that with the idea that we don't exist as atomic beings. We are interdependent. Human beings are interdependent with others. I can't exist by myself. There's so many. I mean, I don't make my own food, right? I depend on others for my food. I've depended on others for my medical care. I probably wouldn't be alive if it weren't for other people that I did exchanges with, or that I bought things from, or got help from. So we're interdependent. So if you combine those two things, time, temporal, right, and interdependence between people, then it's completely impractical to do stupid things that would be self-destructive for me by jumping off a cliff. Or so that's what we're doing. If we have an ecological footprint which is not sustainable, and we're pumping greenhouse gases into the air, into the atmosphere, it's sort of like smoking cigarettes or drinking excessively, knowing what the outcome is likely to be. It's going to be self-destructive.
Yeah, and I completely agree with you, and I think it's something that sort of as you're saying that, though, I think that I would call it the radical egoist response is dealing with accepting even that climate change is true, and that it's a real issue. The full effects of that problem, I will expire before the full effects of that problem come to fruition, and therefore, why should I care?
Yeah, well, I don't think a lot of people would be sympathetic toward that, and if that was
I don't either.
Yeah, if that was what the argument made by those who don't think we have an obligation to future generations, those who don't think climate change matters, if the argument were reduced to, in essence, what you just said, which I believe it can be, the argument being, I don't care about anything other than my immediate well-being for myself, my immediate pleasure,
in my own time.
Or for the next few years or whatever. I don't think a lot of people would have sympathy for that. So I think when we get more clear about it, we realize that like it or not, we are interdependent. Nations are interdependent. Individuals are interdependent, and generations, which is sort of an abstract concept, because there actually aren't generations. There's just constant birth and death and replenishment of people. When all those arbitrary concepts go away, you are left simply with, do I care or do I not care about anything other than my immediate pleasure? Yeah. Hey, well, it looks like we're out of time. I'll let you wrap it up, Hale.
I mean, the conversation, folks, could go on for a lot longer. I think we've we've covered some ground, and it's a difficult discussion, but I hope that you guys got something out of it, and maybe at the end of the day we can all take our own personal responsibility as members of the collective community a little more seriously when it comes to our current climate situation. Thanks for listening.